What does a city planner actually do? We'll talk about that with Josh Stevens, author of a new book, Planners Across America, on this episode of the Land Matters podcast. Well, welcome to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. There's so much happening today in the world's cities: an affordable housing crisis, public health challenges, preparing for and mitigating against climate change, that the job of the city planner has become a furiously busy one, requiring a singular talent for multitasking and keeping everything organized. It's a daunting and inspiring task all at the same time to plan for the future and implement impactful policies. The Lincoln Institute has been immersed in urban planning for quite some time and has brought together about 30 big city planners every year for about 20 years now to network and share stories and try to figure out what to concentrate on next. That's been in partnership with the American Planning Association and the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. We've also taken a hard look at what it takes to see more regional planning, that is, crossing boundaries across cities and towns and even states and nations. And most recently, we've had a big focus on scenario planning, which involves looking at different possible futures and taking community input to figure out which scenario will work best. And we can talk about this as we go along, but one interesting feature about scenario planning is that it can be modified as time passes to see what works and to see what's not working. Well, Josh Stevens is contributing editor of the California Planning and Development Report, the state's foremost independent publication dedicated to urban planning. He previously edited the Planning Report and the Metro Investment Report, monthly publications covering, respectively, land use and infrastructure in Southern California. He's a contributor to Planetizen, Next City, the Architect's Newspaper, Architecture Magazine, Metropolis, Planning Magazine, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other publications. And he is author of Planners Across America, a collection of interviews with big city planning directors around the United States, published by Planetizen Press in 2022. He's also, by the way, an alum of the Lincoln Institute Journalists Forum and has been a fantastic participant in that annual workshop on a variety of topics. Josh Stevens, welcome to the program.
Anthony, thank you. It's always great to be involved with the Lincoln Institute. Glad to be here.
First off, let's talk about the process that went into this book, the people that you ended up focusing on, and perhaps starting with this, why you thought it was important to put the spotlight on these city planners.
Fundamentally, this book is a result of my curiosity. I live in Los Angeles. I write mainly about California, but like any good urban planner, I'm curious about many, many different cities. With Planetizen's blessing, I just sort of dreamed up the idea of doing interviews with planning directors around the country. We settled on the idea of interviewing big city planning directors, which we initially defined as the 50 largest cities by population in the United States. At any rate, what myself and my editor, James Braswell at Planetizen, sort of agreed on was that, well, the planning directors of the 50 biggest cities, for better or for worse, collectively affect the largest number of people compared to any other equivalent jurisdiction. So we went with it.
Now, these are people who are, I think it's fair to say, behind the scenes, right? The average citizen, even the more engaged citizens, might not know what happens in the planning office for a given metropolis. But you have, with these interviews, brought them out from behind the scenes. And I'm just curious, were they happy to talk? What do you make of this incredibly influential position that is in a little bit of obscurity?
I think you've hit on what emerged as one of the theses of the book. And I think when in doubt, I went with the person who was in charge of long-range planning, partly because I think that when we think of planning directors or the process of planning, yes, it is about permitting buildings and it's about deciding if a development conforms to a certain code or so forth. But I think that we probably think of it as, okay, what should a city look like a decade or 2 or 3 decades planning directors have a huge influence over their cities. They influence all, again, 400,000 to 4 or 8 million people, depending on what city we're dealing with, but they're not necessarily well known. They are not on the level of a mayor or a city council person who are obviously elected officials and by definition in the public spotlight. They're not necessarily like a police chief who is always doing press conferences and so forth. Some planning directors are very low key by nature, or their positions are low key by bureaucratic imperative. As I mentioned, within the 50 largest cities, it's a really diverse range. Obvious big ones like LA and New York. It's what we consider medium-sized center cities, the Denvers and the Wichitas and the Tulsas and the Baltimores. But it's also even some what we would call enormous suburbs. Aurora, Colorado is not in the book, but Mesa, Arizona is. And Mesa, it's just a suburb of Phoenix, but it is over 400,000 people. At any rate, getting in touch with people was sometimes hard. And that to me was interesting, that a position that I think many people would argue ought to be very public and ought to be very accessible by its nature sometimes isn't. And then, of course, some people responded enthusiastically and conducted the interviews accordingly. And to this day, some people haven't responded at all. My last thing on this point is that I presented these interviews as being friendly. None of these interviews are meant to be exposés or gotcha, for a lack of a better word. I wanted to allow planning directors to speak in their own words and to talk about their cities as they saw fit, and then let their stakeholders and other readers of the book be the judges of what they've said.
They are in the room where it happens, and to that extent, they end up having this tremendous influence, but they are almost always deferential to the mayors that they serve at the pleasure of. That's just the politics framework for the job, which sometimes I imagine can be a little bit challenging.
For sure. I think every planning director I spoke with mentioned their respective mayor in some way, shape, or form, either deliberately mentioning, oh, this is the mayor that hired me, or mentioning initiatives that the mayor wanted to pursue. As a result, I think that the planning profession, planners in a lot of ways are mediators by definition. They have their elected officials to answer to. They have their mayors, who almost always are the ones who nominate and sign off on hiring them. And then, of course, they have hundreds of thousands of stakeholders. And I think one thing that is very clear in these interviews is how earnest planning directors are about mediating, about figuring out what different stakeholders need and want and are willing to tolerate. They are mindful of politics. As a result, I would say a lot of the discussions were guarded to an extent. I think we can all imagine that planning directors have thorns in their side, either individual stakeholders or movements or projects they want to get done that are somehow impeded or influenced by bureaucracy. But they didn't normally mention that. I think that's very much closed door sorts of stuff.
Well, let's dive into some of the issues that they're wrestling with. I think one major way that they actually came out from behind the scenes was the following. A number of city planning offices have essentially apologized for the professions being complicit in policies that were harmful to communities of color, like urban renewal and highways through cities, zoning as well, and declared that they are now looking at planning, development, and land use through an equity lens. Now, that has a political and cultural framework, and I'm just wondering, did that really strike you as coming out from behind the scenes and making that declaration?
These interviews were pre-George Floyd, and I would say that equity is present in the interviews. I'm certainly mentioning it in some of my question. In many cases, the planning directors volunteer issues of equity, certainly in terms of community input and of making sure that they are listening to and paying attention to different communities, especially communities of color, especially historically disadvantaged communities. What I think is really interesting, and I think personally is a great positive development in planning, is that several of the directors that I interviewed are foreign born. They came from different countries, often less developed countries. And there's a fairly diverse range of planners among the people I spoke to, which I think is probably very different than if we'd done this book 20 years ago. That's fantastic. I don't want to focus too much on specific cities, but for instance, Seattle planning director Sam Asefa, who is from Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken, he's now in California. He talked so much about equity and so much about his personal background being from Africa and reaching out to African communities and other communities in Seattle to make sure they feel included, to make sure that, again, their needs are attended to and so forth. that was something very inspiring for me. From today's perspective, certainly in the reporting that I do on a regular basis, equity and housing is so intricately tied together because the supply of housing, the cost of housing is what I would say is the foundation of equity in a city, insofar as equity entails the cost of living and people's ability at every income level to live decent, stable, economically prosperous lives in cities. Of course, that's complicated. So many cities are actively trying to add housing. And I think that there are very few cities, certainly on the coast, certainly in California, that can add it fast enough to even begin to bring the costs down. But every bit helps. But of course, the flip side of that are these concerns about gentrification. That is, where are we adding the housing and whom does the housing serve? And even if we want to add housing, and I would add to that transportation infrastructure and other infrastructure, if we want to add that in communities that have traditionally been disadvantaged, how do we do so sensitively in ways that don't disrupt the communities as they are today, even if they do have challenges? So I think that's one of the fundamental challenges that planners face today. Listening to people, especially people who have historically been left out of the planning conversation, is crucial. And much more of that is happening these days. Today, I think that the challenge for many planners is, when have we listened enough? What happens when we get conflicting messages and ideas, even from within individual communities? And I think that one challenge planners face, and understandably so, is there's still some distrust. Communities that did experience urban renewal, for instance, and the displacement and the disadvantage, I don't blame them when they don't necessarily believe that a planner, especially at the big citywide level, has their best interests in mind, because they remember and because they are living with the effects of some really bad, certainly prejudiced decisions that took place decades ago, because planning is nothing if not a long-term profession.
Well, let's pick up on housing. It's a perfect segue. I want to talk about community engagement too, but we'll save that for just a bit. On the matter of housing, if you were to ask anyone in major cities, and that includes hot market cities or legacy cities, post-industrial cities, the challenge looming over us all seems to be housing affordability. So this is a totally unfair question, but what's your sense of how cities can get out of this crisis? And what's your view of this idea that what's most needed through zoning reform and other measures is a dramatic increase in the supply of housing, sort of the supply argument, and increasing the supply of housing, whatever kind of housing it is, including luxury housing? What do you make of that supply argument?
It was interesting writing the book, different perspectives on housing from vastly different situations. For instance, you mentioned legacy cities. Philadelphia is in the book. Philadelphia is still several 100,000 people below its historical peak from the 50s. So what are they doing? They are trying to rehab or redevelop the housing that's already there, which is largely row housing. Dallas and Fort Worth are both in the book. Fort Worth especially has grown exuberantly, and there's an exuberance for the addition of housing. But in Fort Worth, as we can imagine, that is largely greenfield development, sprawl, for lack of a better word, that has occurred over the past few decades and that continues to occur. Even in Dallas, though, for as much housing as they've added, the prices are creeping up there. Dallas is not automatically an affordable city the way that it was decades ago. And then, of course, we have the coastal cities on both coasts where the cities are largely built out and they are truly struggling with how to add housing and where. My personal view is part of it, you look at the prices and you look at where the prices are highest, and that's where you need to add housing. You need to add it at every level. There's an argument that there's no such thing as trickle-down housing. I don't buy that. I live in Los Angeles and there's more than enough money to go around. And we talk about luxury housing. If you don't build luxury housing, that doesn't mean that wealthy and high-income people are not going to move to LA. They're simply going to move into whatever the next best housing is. And that pushes people down. And eventually, some people are left with no place to live. We do need to add luxury housing in high-cost places to accommodate the people who can afford it. And I think ideally that frees up space and frees up capital and opportunity and sometimes public funds to then also build deed-restricted affordable housing and hopefully maintain a supply of naturally occurring affordable housing, housing that already exists that isn't necessarily premium and luxury, but that is perfectly attractive to people at the right price points. There's another interesting discussion here that I think this book represents, which is to one extent, housing depends on individual markets, the LA housing market, the Dallas housing market, the Philadelphia housing market. But as we saw in the pandemic, the housing market is a little bit more national today than it probably was 3 years ago. People have moved out of certain cities. Some of them have moved to rural areas or small towns for lifestyle reasons. Others moved partly because of work from home. People have moved from LA to Phoenix, from San Francisco to Boise or Reno or Vegas, and there are other equivalents around the country. And I think it's going to be really interesting in the next, say, decade to see how this filters out. Some cities that where we assumed growth forever, especially in California, California cities have topped out. Some have even shrunk. San Francisco is smaller today than it was 3 years ago. Those people went somewhere. I know the Lincoln Institute's really interested in legacy cities. I'm interested to see, will people from high cost places move to lower cost legacy cities, filling in some of that infill development that might be, again, undervalued or not been redeveloped. There's an element of the national housing market. The housing market is simply national these days. Again, I think fundamentally, if we look purely at cost, we have to provide multiple types of housing in those high cost cities. And then, of course, we haven't discussed this yet, but there's environmental concerns and about whether a city like a Fort Worth can and should continue to be building out and out and out, inducing long commutes and building on what's currently untrammeled land.
Well, let's move next to the matter of zoning reform. We've seen a number of statewide measures. They're virtually all aimed at this idea of increasing the supply and variety of housing, more multifamily housing specifically, and upzoning around transit stations, legalizing accessory dwelling units, a whole menu under these statewide zoning reform efforts. What's your take on that? Because we've seen a backlash, and that's made it about local control. In some ways, it is an overriding of local control, and that puts planners in a tough spot, does it not?
For sure. We talked about the relationship between planners and their mayors and their city council people, for instance. But you're absolutely right. States are involved as well. What happens in state capitals affects what happens in cities. And I think that is, as you've suggested, a relatively new or newly resurgent phenomenon, for better or for worse. And I think it's complicated. Certainly in some states, cities are seen as more liberal than the state overall. And that factors into how state houses treat their big cities. In California, it's not so much a liberal conservative situation as it is simply a local control versus statewide interest situation. There definitely is rivalry and power struggles between locals and states. Some of that depends on how tax money flows, about who controls the revenues and the disbursements. And in some cases, it's simply a matter of how much power state constitutions give them to dictate local land use. So in California, the state has been very aggressive about telling cities that they must add housing. Essentially, they must upzone in most cases. Fortunately, in many places, as you said, TOD is part of the upzoning. TOD in many cases was supported by states, and everyone in most places want to see those investments come to fruition and be capitalized on. So interestingly, I think more than half the cities in this book have new transit lines that have gone in, that the transit agency has installed. And now the cities are, as you've said, updating their zoning codes to complement those transit lines. And I think one big danger is if there's a backlash against density, then we might end up with a lot of transit lines that are underutilized if, in fact, we don't get good, dense development around those stations. I think one other thing about zoning is that zoning is a document. And I think that what's interesting or funny is that almost every single city that I spoke to at the time, and probably still, was in the process of doing a major update, either of their general plan or of very large community plans. It's almost as if the updating process, the general plan process, it never ends. And some of the plan directors talked to me about, made gestures of stacks of paper many inches thick that represent their zoning code, some of which have accreted over many decades to the point where they're almost incomprehensible. And some planners are charged with basically starting from scratch. and trying to streamline and update those codes. And that's a challenging task. And I think the big challenge there is how long does the update process take? And by the time it's done, are we living in a new world than we were when the thing was first drafted? And I think obviously COVID illustrates how quickly things can change. And sometimes the documents don't change nearly that quickly.
Well, cities are also, of course, facing down the climate crisis. I look at that as twin challenges: how to build resilience and how to contribute to mitigating the problem. Who's doing really well on this front, would you say?
That's a great question. I think that everyone's aware of it. Again, many of these planning directors are very enthusiastic about their new transit lines. They want people to use it. They are mindful of the need to reduce automobile dependence. Many of these cities have some great new public outdoor amenities that they've either implemented or are trying to implement. For instance, the Beltline in Atlanta. I talked a lot about that when I interviewed the Atlanta planning director. There are some river projects. Tulsa has a project with its river designed that doesn't necessarily reduce carbon emissions, but it gets people out and about in the natural environment. And I would think that they implied certainly more aware of environmentalism. In Houston, very well known, the bayous that have been renovated are now tremendous public amenities. Ultimately, I think we know empirically the greenest cities are going to be the ones that are already built and that are densest and largest. The New Yorks and the San Franciscos and the Philadelphias and even the Los Angeleses of the world, because they're already built up, because they're relatively dense, are going to have lower emissions than certain other cities. And of course, climate matters. LA, in some ways, is a more efficient city than a Minneapolis, even though Minneapolis has a lot of light rail per capita. But LA has a climate where you're not burning energy to heat it so much in the winter and to cool it so much in the summer. So, I think planning directors are all aware of this. Certainly in my experience in California, there are a lot of mandates to combat climate change. I think that planners like those mandates because they interpret it as densification and mixed use and trans-oriented development, all of which I think that they consider to be good urbanism, regardless of the climate impacts. And of course, the climate impacts are going to shift with new transportation technologies. With the climate impacts with electric vehicles are going to be very different than the traditional internal combustion vehicles, and potentially with self-driving cars, which I didn't really get much into in the book, but I think that every planning director today is trying to anticipate what self-driving cars mean for their cities. And I don't think anyone has a clear answer just yet.
Well, this might be really stepping back, but on the topic of community engagement, which you brought up earlier, Jane Jacobs, an environmentalist, rose up against some truly bad projects in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Do you have the sense that the pendulum has swung too far, as in any group of people, and especially established residents, but also environmentalists invoking those sort of 70s era's environmental laws? They seem to be able to have veto power against just about anything, whether it's bike lanes or multifamily housing or clean energy infrastructure. So how do these city planners possibly balance that notion of community engagement? But what about this veto power?
I think it's a great question. I think that most big city planners would say that that might be their fundamental challenge, building consensus in diverse cities. I think most planners today are what we would call progressive. They want to do the right thing. They probably have ideas and pet projects that they would love to promote to their cities. But I think that, and this goes back to my original premise of some planning directors are, kind of shy, for lack of a better word, that the job of a planner today is very much about listening. And they know they have to listen. They know they have to respect the communities. But as you've said, many communities are empowered, and some of the power is unevenly distributed to the extent that some communities have louder voices. And some communities will invoke people like Jane Jacobs in ways that are not necessarily beneficial for the city as a whole, or might even be disingenuous. And that's somewhat tied into the electoral situation with city council people who get elected by local people as opposed to planning directors who are sort of caught in the middle. So personally, I would love if planning directors felt more assertive in some ways, more willing to share their professional vision for what their city can and should be, and to have more opportunity to explain why their vision is going to benefit a wide number of people And again, be more proactive. I think they have to listen a lot. I don't know what the solution to that is. Public outreach is always going to be imperfect. There are new methods for sure. Many cities are using more electronic methods. The idea of attending a meeting online or sending input by social media to potentially reach people who aren't the proverbial people who show up at a community meeting at a time that happens to be convenient for a certain constituency. A few planning directors discussed what they basically described as little academies whereby the department teaches stakeholders about planning. They had little seminars or a series of classes where they're inviting everyday involved citizens to come and learn about planning, learn the terminology, learn the perspectives, and demystify planning. And I think in some ways undo some of the bad reputation that planning may have gotten from the Robert Moseses of the world, who we all know was the antagonist of Jane Jacobs, and make people more savvy. In my experience, I think many of the sentiments against good planning are not so much substantial, but simply about mistrust, not understanding what planning really is, and not understanding that part of the art of planning is of, again, mediation and consensus building. People often believe the planner is favoring one group or another, when in fact the planner might be very earnestly in the middle. And I think that if planners can assert their power of mediation and their earnestness potentially more powerfully, maybe things will move more quickly. It takes forever to get these plans done. And I think part of the delay is often the endless listening. And then sometimes the listening some elected official might veto. It's very complicated. It's necessary, but it's complicated.
Well, it makes the job sound that much more challenging. So this is a group of people that's quite worthy of taking a look at. Josh Stevens, author of the book Planners Across America, thank you for joining the conversation at Land Matters.
My pleasure. Great to see you, Tony. And again, always great to be involved with Lincoln.
And thanks to everyone for tuning in to this episode of the Land Matters podcast. We hope you'll rate, share, and subscribe to Land Matters so you never miss a show. And for more information about the Lincoln Institute's work in urban planning, just go to our website, lincolninst.edu. And or follow us on Twitter. The handle is @landpolicy. So until next time, I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening.